The morning Lydia Quinn walked into Harmon Briggs's general store with her mother's silver wrapped in an old flour sack. Her hands were not shaking, and that steadiness cost her more than the trembling ever would have. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the canyon country of southwestern Texas, where the land was red and broken, and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have survived tremendous violence. The town of Red Rock Crossing sat at the edge of a dry creek bed that filled with rushing brown water every spring and forgot itself by July. There were maybe 200 souls in Red Rock Crossing, not counting the homesteaders scattered across the surrounding territory, and most of them had opinions about Lydia Quinn that they shared freely whenever she was not in earshot. She was 28 years old. She had been widowed for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Quinn, had died of a fever that swept through the valley the summer before, taking 3 other men and 2 children with it, the way fevers did in those days without apology or mercy. Thomas had been a decent man, not a passionate one, but decent, and Lydia had loved him in the practical, daily way that people love the things they depend on. When he was gone, she understood for the first time how much of the ranch's operation had lived quietly inside his head, in knowledge she had never thought to ask him to share. The Quinn land was 460 acres of hard Texas ground. It had been homesteaded by Thomas's father before the war, and Thomas had worked every inch of it for 20 years. There were cattle, not many, 43 head now after the summer losses, and a small herd of horses that Thomas had been breeding selectively before he died. There was a house, solid stone and timber, 2 rooms and a loft, with a porch that faced west so you could watch the sun go down over the canyon rim every evening if you had time to stop and look. Lydia rarely had time to stop and look. What Thomas had not left her was money, or any clear understanding of the debts he had been managing. She discovered these in the weeks following his burial, going through his papers in the flat cedar box he kept under the bed. There were notes signed with other men's names, amounts she could not immediately reconcile, and a tax notice from the county that she had not known about, for back taxes on the property that had accumulated over 3 years, while Thomas apparently believed they could be handled later. Later had arrived. The county tax assessor, a thin man named Aldous Greeley who wore a collar too tight for his neck and seemed to take a quiet pleasure in other people's financial difficulties, had come out to the Quinn place in August and informed Lydia that unless the back taxes of $112 were paid in full by the 1st of November, the property would be seized and sold at public auction. $112. She had lain awake those first nights after Greeley's visit doing arithmetic in the dark. The cattle could not be sold, yet without a significant loss because prices were down, and she had no way to drive them to market alone. Thomas's horses were her best asset, but selling them meant losing the breeding program he had spent years building, and something in her resisted that destruction of his work even now, even when she was desperate. She had taken in washing from the families in town, and she had sold eggs, and she had mended clothes for Mrs. Beaumont at the boarding house, and she had added every cent she earned to the tin on the kitchen shelf, and in 14 months of widowhood she had managed to save $23.40, which left her approximately $89 short of keeping her home. She had written to her brother in Kansas, but he had his own family and his own difficulties, and his letter back had been full of sympathy and short on anything else. And so she had gone to the cedar chest in the corner of the bedroom, the chest that had come with her from her mother's house when she married Thomas 9 years ago, and she had lifted the lid and taken out the silver. Her mother, Eleanor Marsh, had been a woman of considerable refinement in a land that did not reward refinement especially. She had carried the silver service from Missouri when she came west with Lydia's father in 1855, 12 pieces in total, a tea service of 4, 6 forks and spoons of the heavy old kind, and a small-footed bowl that Eleanor had received as a wedding gift from her own mother. Eleanor had polished that silver every Sunday of Lydia's childhood without fail, and Lydia had sat beside her sometimes and helped, and the smell of the polishing cloth was one of the oldest memories she owned. Alina had died the year before Thomas, which meant Lydia had lost both of them inside of 18 months, and the silver was the last physical object that connected her to her mother in any tangible way. She had not touched it since Alina's death. She had not been able to bring herself to polish it or even to open the cloth it was wrapped in, because she knew that the sight of it would undo something in her that she could not afford to have undone. But the 1st of November was 11 days away, and $23.40 would not save 460 acres. She wrapped the silver carefully in the old flour sack, the way Alina had wrapped it in a proper cloth, and she drove the buckboard into Red Rock Crossing on a Tuesday morning when the air had that cold clarity it gets in Texas autumn, sharp and clean as a new blade. She went to Harmon Briggs's store because Briggs was known to deal in goods and valuables, and because the bank's loan officer had already told her, politely but without any ambiguity, that the bank did not extend credit to widows without male cosigners. She placed the flour sack on Briggs's counter and unwrapped it, and Briggs looked at the silver the way men like Briggs look at things, assessing, not admiring. "Good quality," he said. He turned one of the forks in his fat fingers. "Old work, Missouri style if I had to guess." "It came from Missouri," she said. Her voice was steady. She kept it steady by concentrating on the wood grain of his counter, the way the knots ran in long ovals. "It belonged to my mother. I'll give you $60 for the lot." She looked up at him then. "The silver alone is worth considerably more than that. Maybe in St. Louis it is. Out here I'd have to wait years for the right buyer. $60 is my offer, Mrs. Quinn." She needed $89. 60 was not enough. 75, she said. Briggs put the fork down and shook his head slowly with the particular enjoyment of a man who knows he has the advantage. It was at this precise moment that the door of the general store opened and Gideon Cooper walked in. She did not know him. She had not seen him before, which was not unusual because Red Rock Crossing sat on a route that brought strangers through with some regularity, men moving between the border and the northern territories, cattlemen scouting land, surveyors, the occasional federal marshal. What she noticed about him first, without particularly meaning to, was that he moved carefully. Not cautiously, not like a man expecting trouble, but carefully, the way a person moves when they are paying attention to the world around them. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, with a broad-shouldered frame that had the kind of leanness that comes from work rather than deprivation. His hat was dark with trail dust, and there was a quality to his face: strong jaw, steady gray eyes, a scar along the line of his left cheekbone that had healed cleanly, that suggested he had seen difficult things and had not been made cruel by them. He paused just inside the door, taking in the scene with those quiet gray eyes, and Lydia turned back to Briggs. 65, Briggs said, and from his tone he was offering it as a concession when in fact it was still robbery. "I need 75, she said again. "Mrs. Quinn." Briggs leaned his elbows on the counter. "I understand you're in a difficult position, but I am a businessman, not a charity." "I wasn't asking for charity," she said evenly. "I was asking for fair value." The stranger had moved to the far end of the counter to look at some goods displayed there, but she was aware of him the way you become aware of someone who is listening without appearing to. Briggs sighed the sigh of a man performing reluctant generosity. 67.50. That is absolutely my final offer. Lydia looked at her mother's silver laid out on the worn counter. The footed bowl caught the light from the store's single small window and held it, the way good silver does, as though keeping something warm inside itself. She thought of Alina's hands on it, the Sunday mornings, the smell of the polishing cloth. "I'll take it," she said. She kept her voice level. She kept her face composed. She accepted Briggs's 67.50 in bills, tucked them into the pocket of her coat, and she did not look at the silver again as she rewrapped the cloth around it, because if she looked at it again she would not be able to leave. She left. The buckboard was tied at the post outside, and she sat on the seat for a moment before she took up the reins, her hands resting in her lap, looking at the street of Reed Rock Crossing in the cold autumn morning. Then she clicked to the horse and started home, and the 8 miles between town and the Quinn place had never felt so long. She did not cry. She had gotten out of the habit of crying sometime in the past 14 months. There was too much to do for crying. She did not notice that the stranger from Briggs's store had stepped back out onto the porch and watched her drive away with an expression on his face that was difficult to name, but was something very close to recognition. Not of her face, which he had never seen before, but of the kind of moment she was living through. He had seen that particular composure before, the composure of people holding themselves together so precisely and completely that you could almost hear the effort of it. He stood on Briggs's porch a moment longer, then went back inside. Gideon Cooper had come to Reed Rock Crossing for no dramatic reason. He was a cattle broker by occupation, which in 1878 meant he moved between ranches and buyers, negotiating the sale of herds, and he had heard that there were horses being bred in this part of the territory that were worth looking at. He had also been drifting somewhat, if he was honest with himself, in the way a man drifts after enough loss. He had lost his own ranch in the Panhandle 4 years ago to a combination of drought and bad debt, not so different in its mechanics from what was happening to Lydia Quinn, though he had not known her name then, and did not know it now except as the woman who had sold her mother's silver at Harmon Briggs's counter. He asked Briggs, while buying the provisions he needed, about local ranchers. He said he was interested in horses. "There's the Quinn widow," Briggs said, wrapping salt pork in paper. "Her late husband was breeding quarter horses. Nice animals, but she's in arrears with the county, probably going to lose the land come November 1st. If she does, the horses go to auction with everything else." Something tightened in Gideon's chest. "How much does she owe?" Briggs, who enjoyed information as a form of currency, told him. Gideon said nothing further about it. He paid for his provisions, loaded them into his saddlebags, and spent the rest of the afternoon at the livery stable getting his horse reshod and talking with the livery man, a leathery old fellow named Pete Carver who had been in Reed Rock Crossing since before it was called Reed Rock Crossing. Pete knew everything about everyone, the way livery men do. He told Gideon about Thomas Quinn's death, about Lydia Quinn's 14 months of managing the ranch alone, with only a hired hand who had left in the spring when wages ran out. He told him about the tax situation and Greeley the assessor, and he told him about the silver, not because he had witnessed the sale, but because Briggs had already mentioned it to 2 other men, because men like Briggs could not keep their advantages to themselves. Gideon ate his supper at the boarding house that evening, a quiet meal of stew and bread, and he thought about things. He thought about a ranch he had once owned and lost, and about how the losing of it had felt, and about the particular silence of an empty place that had been full. He thought about 6750 and a silver bowl catching light, and about a woman who had driven away from the sale of her mother's things without letting her face do anything at all. He was not a man who made grand gestures. He had grown up in hard-working, practical circumstances in eastern Tennessee before coming west at 20, and the years since had reinforced practicality above nearly everything else. But he was also a man who believed that certain things were wrong in a simple, uncomplicated way that did not require long analysis. And one of those things was watching someone lose what they had earned through honest work, because the mechanics of debt and taxation ground them down without mercy or acknowledgement of what the loss actually cost. He knew what he was going to do by the time he finished his stew. He was not sure exactly why he was going to do it, and he would not examine that question closely for some weeks. In the morning he went back to Briggs's store before Briggs had fully opened. He knocked until Briggs answered in his suspenders. "The silver you bought yesterday," Gideon said. "I want to buy it from you." Briggs blinked the sleep from his eyes and then got very alert very quickly, the way men like him do when money is available. "That silver's worth more than I paid for it." "I know that," Gideon said. "Name your price." Briggs named it. It was $80, which was considerably more than he had paid Lydia and considerably less than the silver was actually worth. But it was the price Lydia had needed, and it was the price Gideon paid. He paid it in coin, the kind of payment that does not require paperwork. He wrapped the silver back in the flour sack the way he had seen it wrapped, with the cloth tucked under to protect the pieces, and he tied it carefully to his saddlebag. Then he asked Carver at the livery where the Quinn ranch was. He did not ride there immediately. He spent the day riding the territory in the other direction, getting a feel for the country, looking at the land the way a man looks at land when he is thinking about what it could be. The canyon country around Reed Rock Crossing was genuinely remarkable, red stone walls rising from the valley floor with that particular gravity that stone has when it has been standing for 10,000 years. The scrub oak and juniper clinging to the slopes in defiant green. The sky overhead that deep southwestern blue that makes everything below it look like a painting of itself. He came back through town in the late afternoon and stopped at the county assessor's office. Aldous Greeley was behind his desk in his too-tight collar, writing in a ledger with the focused pleasure of a man who finds numbers satisfying, which they probably are when they represent other people's debts. "Quinn property," Gideon said, standing at Greeley's desk. "I want to pay the back taxes." Greeley looked up with an expression that mingled surprise and disappointment, which told Gideon everything he needed to know about Greeley's character. "The taxes are owed by the property owner," Greeley said. "Not by a third party can pay taxes owed on a property," Gideon said. "I know the law well enough. I'm paying the taxes in full on behalf of the property. $112. Greeley opened his mouth and then closed it. The law was indeed clear on this point, frustratingly so from Greeley's perspective. Gideon paid the taxes. Greeley wrote the receipt and stamped it with the county seal with the energy of a man being robbed of something he had been looking forward to. Gideon took the receipt, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. He rode toward the Quinn ranch as the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim, turning everything amber and long-shadowed. The Quinn property revealed itself gradually, the way good land does. First the fence posts, weathered but sound, the wire strung taut and straight. Then the pasture where 12 horses moved in the golden evening light. Beautiful animals, Thomas Quinn's careful breeding evident in the way they carried themselves. Then the house, stone and timber on a slight rise, and the porch facing west exactly as Pete Carver had described, and the kitchen garden that had been tended through the season and was now put to bed for winter in the way of someone who plans to be here in the spring. He did not go to the door. He had thought about this on the ride out, about what it would mean to arrive at her door with the silver and the tax receipt, about how a woman who had driven away from Briggs's counter with her face composed and her hands steady would receive that kind of charity from a stranger. He understood, with some precision, how it would feel. He would have refused it himself in her place. He would have refused it with gratitude and still refused it, because there is a pride in self-sufficiency that is not vanity but survival, a careful maintenance of the belief that you can manage your own life, and when someone arrives with proof that you cannot, no matter how kindly offered, it takes something from you. He tied his horse to the fence post by the gate, quiet in the deepening dusk. The lights were on in the house. Through the window he could see the warm movement of lamplight. He took the flour sack from his saddlebag and set it on the porch carefully at the center of the top step. He took the tax receipt from his shirt pocket, folded it into a small square, and tucked it just under the lip of the silver bowl inside the cloth so it would be found when she unwrapped it. He stood back and looked at what he had done. Then he rode away. He was not a man who required witnesses to his own actions. He told himself this was the whole of it, a practical correction of an unjust situation, the kind of thing any decent person might do if they had the means and the opportunity. He told himself, It had nothing to do with the steadiness of her hands or the careful composure of her face as she drove away from the sale of her mother's things. He told himself this with reasonable conviction and was not entirely successful. He stayed in town 2 more days, which was perhaps longer than strict practicality required. Lydia found the flour sack in the morning. She came out before dawn the way she always did, pulling her coat around her against the cold to start the day's work. She nearly stepped on it before she saw it, and then she stopped and stood very still for a moment, looking at the shape of it in the gray pre-dawn light. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table and unwrapped it slowly, the way you unwrap something when you are afraid of what might be inside. The silver was all there, 12 pieces, her mother's silver, and the small-footed bowl was at the center, and when it caught the light from the lamp she had to put both her hands on the table and press them flat to keep them steady. The receipt fell out as she lifted the bowl. She picked it up and read it twice because the first reading seemed impossible. Quinn property, back taxes, paid in full. October 14, 1878. She sat down at the kitchen table. She sat there for a long time with her hands pressed flat on the table and the silver spread around her and the receipt in front of her. Then she got up, lit the stove, made coffee, and sat back down because her legs were not entirely reliable. Who would do this? That was the question her mind kept arriving at and then veering away from because there was no reasonable answer. She had no relatives with resources. She had few enough friends. Reverend Maddox at the church had been kind, but he was hardly wealthy. The ranchers in the valley were managing their own difficulties. She thought of everyone she knew and could not arrive at an explanation. It came to her slowly, as she sat with her coffee cooling in the cup, that it must have been someone at Briggs's store. Someone who had heard or seen and had the money and the inclination. She went through the morning in her memory, looking for who had been there. There had been one other person, the man near the end of the counter. She did not know his name. She did not know if he was still in town. She knew only that he had been there and that she needed to find him and tell him that she could not accept this. She drove to town that same morning, as soon as she had done the essential morning chores, because the essential morning chores could not be abandoned simply because the world had presented her with a mystery and a debt of gratitude that sat in her chest like something she could not digest. She asked at Briggs's store first, because if the stranger had come back and bought the silver, Briggs would know about it and would have already told everyone. Briggs had already told everyone. Fella came in first thing yesterday morning, Briggs said, with the particular satisfaction of a man at the center of an interesting story. Bought the silver for $80, which I thought was fair, and rode out. I believe he's staying at the boarding house still, though Pete said he saw him in town yesterday afternoon. His name Briggs did not know. He had not asked and the man had not offered. She went to the boarding house where Mrs. Henshaw told her that yes, there was a gentleman staying, a Mr. Cooper, Gideon Cooper, and he had gone out early, but she expected him back for the midday meal if Mrs. Quinn wanted to wait. Lydia did not want to wait. She thanked Mrs. Henshaw and went looking. She found him at the livery stable, talking with Pete Carver about the horses he had seen in the surrounding territory. She saw him before he saw her, and she stopped for a moment in the doorway of the stable where the morning light came in long and golden from the east, and she looked at him with the assessment she had not permitted herself when she was at Briggs's counter holding herself together. He was talking to Pete with the easy attention of someone genuinely interested in what the other person is saying, and Pete, who was not easily impressed, was talking back with the animated energy of a man who rarely gets a good audience. She walked in. Both men looked up. Pete registered her arrival with a slight raising of his brows that suggested he found this interesting. Gideon Cooper went very still in the way that is different from being startled. It was the stillness of someone who has been expecting something and is now deciding how to meet it. "Mr. Cooper," she said. "Ma'am," he took his hat off. "My name is Lydia Quinn. I believe you left something on my porch." Pete Carver suddenly discovered an urgent need to check on something at the far end of the stable. Gideon turned his hat in his hand slowly. He had the look of a man composing his thoughts carefully. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, "I did. I need to understand why," she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. "And then I need to return to you what is yours." "It's not mine," he said. "It was yours to begin with. You paid for it. That was a business transaction between me and Briggs. The silver belongs to your family." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at things when she was trying to understand them. "And the tax receipt." Something moved across his face briefly and was controlled. "A practical matter. The land should belong to the person who works it. That is a generous philosophy, Mr. Cooper, but it does not explain why a stranger would spend money he is not obligated to spend on behalf of a woman he has never met." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in their stalls around them, and the smell of hay and leather and horses was very present. "I had a ranch once," he said, "in the Panhandle. I lost it in 1874. Debt and drought, the usual combination. I know what it costs when the land goes." He met her eyes. "Not just what it costs in money." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I cannot accept charity." "I know you can't," he said. "This isn't charity. Consider it a loan if you need to. You can pay me back when you sell the cattle in the spring." "I don't know you." "No," he said simply. "You don't." She looked at him for a long time. He did not fidget under it, did not look away, did not try to fill the silence with words. She respected that, the willingness to let a silence be. "What is your business in Reed Rock Crossing?" she asked. "I'm a cattle broker. I came through looking at horses. I'd heard there was a quality breeding operation in this territory." "My husband's horses," she said. "Yes." She turned slightly and looked at the light coming through the stable door, the town going about its morning outside, the ordinary busy life of a place. Then she turned back. "Come to the ranch on Friday morning," she said. "I'll show you the horses. We can discuss terms for a loan." He nodded, as if this were a reasonable business arrangement and not something entirely else. "Friday morning, Mrs. Quinn." She drove back to the ranch with her mother's silver wrapped in the flour sack beside her on the buckboard seat, and she did not examine too closely what she was feeling, because there was too much work to do, and examining feelings was a luxury she had not practiced in a long time. Friday came with a frost that left the grass silver and crackling underfoot. Lydia was up before the sun, as she always was, and she did the morning feeding and checked the horses and baked a pan of cornbread, because it seemed rude not to have something to offer if a person was coming to talk business. And she told herself firmly that the cornbread was a practical consideration, and not anything else. Gideon Cooper arrived at mid-morning on a well-kept chestnut gelding, and he arrived exactly when he said he would, which she noticed and filed away without comment. She met him at the fence and showed him the horses. There were 12 of them, Thomas's careful breeding program spanning 5 years. The result was animals with the stamina of the Texas range horse and the quickness of the Eastern Quarter horse, compact and well-muscled, with the deep chests that meant endurance. She watched Gideon watch the horses, and there was something in the quality of his attention that told her he knew what he was looking at. He did not pretend expertise he did not have, and he did not discount what was in front of him. "These are exceptional animals," he said. "Thomas knew what he was doing," she said, pride in her voice for her husband's work and also for the work itself. "The mare there," he gestured to a dark bay moving along the far fence. "She's got Eastern blood, thoroughbred maybe." Her grandfather, Lydia said, and she was surprised into something like pleasure at the accuracy of his observation. "Thomas found her dam at a sale in San Antonio. He saw what she could contribute." They walked along the fence, talking about the horses. She found herself speaking more than she had intended to, about Thomas's breeding notes, about which animals she was planning to keep and which to sell in the spring, about the prices she hoped to get. He listened in that careful way he had, and he asked questions that were specific and intelligent. And gradually the conversation stopped feeling like a performance of professional competence and started feeling like a genuine exchange between two people who were interested in the same subject. After the horses, she brought him to the porch and they sat with coffee. She had coffee, real coffee, a treat she rarely allowed herself, and the view west toward the canyon rim, which in the morning was lit from the side in a way that made the red stone look almost alive. "The loan," she said. "I can pay you back $40 in the spring when I sell the horses. The other half by summer when the cattle go to market." "There's no interest," he said. "Mr. Cooper, Gideon," he said. "If we're going to be in a business arrangement, the name is Gideon." She looked at him. "Gideon," she said, "I will pay you interest at a reasonable rate." "We'll argue about that in the spring," he said, "when you have the money in hand." She held her coffee cup and looked at the canyon rim. "Why did you stay in town?" she asked. "After you left the silver. You must have done it and planned to ride on." He was quiet for a moment. "I had more business to look at," he said. "In the territory." It was not entirely untrue. There were horses he had wanted to look at. It was also not entirely the whole truth. She looked at him sideways with the expression of a woman who has been managing her own affairs for 14 months and can recognize an incomplete answer. She let it go. "Will you look at the cattle before you leave?" she asked. "If you broker cattle, I might be able to get a better price in the spring than going to market directly." "Yes," he said. "I'll look at them." He stayed until the afternoon. They walked the property, the pastures, the winter-dormant garden, the stone house with its 2 rooms and loft, the small barn and the larger corral. She showed him the land the way she had come to know it, not as Thomas's land but as her land, her responsibility and her home, the ground she had decided to fight for with her mother's silver and her own stubborn heart. At one point, crossing the dry creek bed that cut through the western pasture, her foot slipped on a lichen-covered stone, and she would have fallen except that he was close enough to catch her arm. He held it just long enough to make sure she was stable, and let go before the contact became anything other than practical. But her arm remembered it afterward, the warmth and steadiness of it, and she was cross with herself for noticing. He left before sundown with a handshake on the business terms. He would broker the horses and the cattle in the spring on her behalf, taking his standard commission, and the loan would be discussed then with whatever interest seemed fair to both parties. She watched him ride out along the fence line and across the open land toward the road to town, and she turned back to her work with the particular efficiency of a woman who will not allow herself to be idle when her thoughts are going somewhere she has not given them permission to go. He came back the following Wednesday with an excuse about wanting to look at the horses again, to assess which ones would sell first and for what price, so he could plan his approach to buyers. It was a legitimate reason. She was aware that it was also, possibly, something more than just a legitimate reason, and she felt something in her that was complicated and warm and too soon, and not something she was ready to name. They spent the morning with the horses. He had brought, unexpectedly, a copy of a livestock journal from San Antonio, folded in his saddlebag because he had thought she might find it useful, and the gesture was so carefully practical, so firmly in the category of professional courtesy rather than personal attention, that she almost smiled. She did not almost smile. She was composed, but she noticed. They had lunch at the kitchen table, salt pork and beans and the last of the cornbread, a simple meal that she apologized for, and he told her was the best meal he had eaten since leaving the Panhandle, which she thought was probably an exaggeration, but delivered with enough genuine conviction that she let herself believe it for the duration of the meal. "Tell me about the Panhandle," she said. "Your ranch there." He set his fork down and looked at the table for a moment. "It was 300 acres east of Amarillo. Cattle, mostly. I ran it with my younger brother for 2 years after my father died." He paused. "The drought took the grass 2 summers running. The debt was already there from buying the extra stock the year before, and when the market dropped, he stopped. We sold what we could and walked away from the rest. It's someone else's land now." "Where is your brother?" "Colorado," he said. "He found better country. He has a wife now and a son. He's doing well." There was real pleasure in that, in the way he said it. "And you?" He met her eyes. I have a skill set that travels well, he said, with a quality that was almost humor but not quite. Cattle brokering pays enough. It suits a man without a fixed address. Do you want a fixed address? She asked. She had not meant to ask it. It came out before she could stop it. Something shifted in his expression. Some days, he said carefully, I think I might. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. I have beans left, she said. If you want more. He smiled then, really smiled, not the polite, manageable expression he wore as default, but something genuine and warm that changed his face completely, and said that yes, he would like more beans, thank you, Mrs. Quinn. Lydia, she said, because apparently they were at that point now. Lydia, he said, and the way he said her name was careful and exact, like a person handling something valuable. November came. The tax deadline passed with the receipt filed and the land secure, and Lydia felt the relief of it not as celebration, but as the absence of a weight she had been carrying so long. She had begun to mistake it for her own bones. She drove to town on the 2nd of November and walked into Greeley's office and confirmed the status of the Quinn property with a composure that she felt he found disappointing. On the way out she passed Gideon coming up the street, and he raised his hat to her and she nodded back, and they both continued on their separate errands, and it was such an ordinary exchange that it should have been nothing at all, except that it was not nothing at all, and she was beginning to accept that as a fact. He had not left town. She had not asked him directly why he was still in Red Rock Crossing, because she was not ready for the answer, or rather she was not ready for the answer she suspected. She was a practical woman. She had been a widow for 14 months. She had not spent those 14 months thinking about the future in the way of a woman who expects to feel what she was apparently beginning to feel, because she had believed that part of herself was retired, done with its work, folded away. She discussed it with no one, because there was no one to discuss it with in the way she would have needed. The women in town were kind enough, but they gossiped, and the last thing she needed was the community of Red Rock Crossing commenting on her private business. She wrote nothing in her journal about it because she was not sure she trusted her own handwriting to be honest with her. She worked. She split wood for the winter. She repaired the fence on the south pasture where a section had come loose. She mended harness leather and cleaned the barn and turned the horses out for exercise in the cold, brilliant mornings, and she watched them run in the frost with the pleasure she always felt watching something beautiful move well. One evening in mid-November, with the temperature dropping and the sky full of stars so thick they looked like spilled flour, she was on the porch wrapping a horse blanket around her shoulders against the cold, looking at the canyon rim under starlight. She heard hooves on the road before she saw the lantern light, and then Gideon was there at the gate. I was riding by, he said, which was not quite true since the Quinn property was not on the way to anywhere from town. Come up, she said. I have coffee left. They sat on the porch in the cold with the coffee warming their hands and the stars very present above them, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that has stopped being empty and become something with its own substance. I have to tell you something, Gideon said after a long while. She waited. When I left the silver on your porch, he said, I told myself it was a practical matter, a correctable injustice. I told myself it had nothing to do with he stopped, with wanting to see if you were all right. Lydia looked at the stars, and I'm not able to go on telling myself that. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. I know it's too soon to say this. I know we've known each other only a matter of weeks. I know you've had a great deal to manage, and I'm not trying to add to that. He paused. But I think you should know that the reason I'm still in Red Rock Crossing is that I can't seem to leave. The night was very still. Somewhere out on the land a coyote called and was answered. I know, she said quietly. He looked at her. I'm not ready, she said, to trust what I'm feeling. It's too new, and I'm still, she searched for the word. Still finding out who I am when I'm only myself and not Thomas Quinn's wife or my mother's daughter. I'm still making that acquaintance. I understand, he said, and she believed him. But I'm not asking you to leave, she said. He nodded slowly, and the night settled around them. Then I won't leave, he said. Not yet. He began making himself genuinely useful, which was either the smartest thing he could have done or simply what was natural to him, and she suspected it was both. He hired on at Pete Carver's livery for a wage that gave him income and a reason to stay, and he came to the Quinn ranch on Saturdays and sometimes on Wednesdays, and he never arrived without a purpose. He helped her repair the north fence entirely, a 3-day job that would have taken her considerably longer alone. He brought a jar of Mrs. Henshaw's preserved peaches one Saturday because he had heard Lydia mention in passing that she had not managed to put up any preserves that summer, and the jar sat on her kitchen shelf, and she looked at it every morning and felt something soft and inconvenient. He was not effusive. He was not a man who spoke his feelings in large quantities. But he was attentive in the particular way of a person who listens when other people speak and remembers afterward, and he was quietly, steadily present in a way that she had not expected to feel safe with this early and this completely. She began to watch for him. She noticed this and acknowledged it without judgment, because the watching did not feel like need the way she had feared it would. It felt like anticipation, like looking forward to something good, and those were feelings she had not had much practice with in the past 2 years. Her daughter, Clara, who was 7 years old and had been handling her father's death with the philosophical resilience of young children who have not yet learned that resilience should be harder, asked Lydia in December who the man was who came on Saturdays. "He is a business associate," Lydia said. "He helps us with the ranch." Clara considered this. She was a serious child with Thomas's dark eyes and Lydia's composure. "He watches you a lot," she said, "when you're not looking." "Does he?" Lydia said, and turned away to stir the pot on the stove so Clara would not see whatever her face was doing. She had not mentioned Clara. She had not mentioned Clara because Clara was the most important fact of her life, and she was careful with important facts, and she had not been certain enough of anything to introduce that complication. But Gideon had met her, naturally, on his second visit to the ranch, when Clara came around the corner of the barn with mud on her boots and straw in her hair, and regarded the stranger with the unblinking assessment of a child who has learned to form her own judgments. He had crouched down to her level without making a production of it, which was the right thing to do, and said, "You must be the person who takes care of those horses." Clara had said, "Mama takes care of the horses. I help." "That's important work," he said seriously. Clara had looked at him for another long moment and then gone back to whatever she had been doing, which Lydia understood to be a form of acceptance. Over the weeks, Clara became incrementally and unself-consciously easier with him, in the way children do when they have decided someone is not a threat. She showed him things, a particular stone she had found with a fossil in it, the nest that some bird had made in the eave of the barn and abandoned before winter. He received these offerings with seriousness and genuine interest, and Lydia, watching, felt something complicated and large move through her. December was cold that year. The temperature dropped below freezing in early December and stayed there most of the month, which was not uncommon in the canyon country, but was brutal for the livestock. Lydia had laid in enough hay, but it was a constant work to keep the water troughs from freezing solid, to keep the horses moving and healthy, to monitor the cattle in the far pasture where the cold came down off the canyon rim in the night. Gideon came one evening in mid-December, in the middle of a cold snap that had everything iron-hard and silver-frosted, and found her at the far water trough breaking ice with a pickaxe in the last of the daylight. He took the pickaxe from her without comment. She would have argued, but her arms were genuinely aching, and broke the remaining ice while she fetched water from the pump, and they worked together in the cold and the fading light with the easy coordination of people who have learned each other's rhythms. When it was done, they stood in the silence of the frozen evening with their breath making clouds in the cold air, and she was suddenly aware of how close they were standing, the warmth of him in the cold, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that this was exactly what she had been afraid of, and exactly what she had been working toward, and possibly those were the same thing. She did not step back. He did not move toward her. They stood in the cold beside the water trough as the last light left the sky, and then she said, "Come inside. You'll freeze." He came inside. They ate supper together, the three of them, she and Clara and Gideon, and the table felt different with 3 people around it. Not better than her memory of Thomas, not a replacement of that shape, but different and its own thing. And that recognition, that the shapes were simply different rather than one being a copy of the other, was something she had needed to understand and had not until that evening. After Clara went to sleep in the loft, Lydia and Gideon sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she poured the last of the whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes into 2 glasses, and she said, "Tell me about Tennessee." He told her about it. He told her about his family's farm in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, the way the fog sat in the valleys in the morning, his father who had been a quiet, methodical man devoted to his land and his family. He told her about coming west at 20 because the East felt already settled, already determined, and he had wanted to find out what he was capable of against something that had not already been decided. He told her about the Panhandle years, the building of the ranch and the losing of it, and about the 4 years since then moving through the territory with his skills and his saddlebags and no fixed address. "Do you miss Tennessee?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "in the way you miss a part of yourself that you left behind, but I don't want to go back." "Where do you want to go?" she asked. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and said, with a simplicity that made it the most direct thing anyone had said to her in years, "I'd like to stay here, if there's any reason for me to." She looked at him for a long time. "Gideon," she said, "I have 43 cattle and 12 horses and 460 acres of hard Texas land and a 7-year-old daughter, and a debt to you that I am absolutely going to pay back in the spring." "I know," he said, "and I am," she looked at her glass, "still working out who I am alone, still learning that I can be enough for myself." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to need me, Lydia, I'm asking if I can be here." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "you can be here." It was not a declaration. It was not yet a promise. But it was the truest thing she had said out loud in a very long time, and he received it the way he received everything, steadily, without making it large, holding it carefully. Christmas came quietly to the Quinn ranch. Lydia made a meal of it: roasted chicken, dried apple pie, the preserved peaches from Mrs. Henshaw's jar, and Gideon came in the morning and spent the day. He brought Clara a set of carved wooden horses, 4 of them, that he had made himself in the evenings at the boarding house, the work of weeks, each one detailed and clearly made by someone who had looked very carefully at actual horses. Clara held them with the reverent care of someone receiving something precious, and Lydia, watching her daughter's face, felt the particular fullness that happens when the heart receives more than it prepared for. He had brought Lydia a book. It was a practical book, a manual on horse breeding and bloodlines, the kind of book that would be genuinely useful for the program she was continuing from Thomas's work. But it was also the kind of book that said, "I have paid attention to what matters to you. I see what you are building." She had made him a pair of gloves, heavy leather, the best she could cut and stitch, lined with wool batting for the winter cold. Practical. She was a practical woman. The care she had put into each stitch was its own language, and they both understood it. In January the weather broke briefly and gave them 2 warm days, the kind of January reprieve that the canyon country sometimes offers, as if the season has forgotten itself temporarily. Gideon saddled 2 horses, and they rode the far pasture while Clara spent the day at the neighboring family's farm, the Hendersons, who had a girl Clara's age, and who had been asking for months if Clara could visit. They rode the land in the January warmth, the red canyon walls brilliant in the slant winter light, and Lydia showed him the corners of the property she had not shown him before. The spring that ran from the cliff face on the northeast corner, reliable even in drought years. The flat top of the mesa on the south boundary where you could see 40 miles in every direction on a clear day. The old-growth juniper on the creek bank that had been there, she suspected, since before anyone currently living was born. At the top of the mesa, they stopped their horses and looked at the 40 miles, and the land stretched out beneath them in all its difficult, extraordinary beauty, red and gold and gray-green. The sky above it the particular deep winter blue that seems like something you could fall into. "I understand why you fought for it," he said. "Yes," she said. "I knew you would." He looked at her then, and she was looking at the land, and she felt his gaze on the side of her face the way you feel the sun when you are turned away from it. She turned to look at him. The winter light was on his face, and the 40 miles were behind him, and she thought very clearly, "I am going to love this man." Not I love him, not yet, but the forward-looking recognition of something already in motion, the awareness of a direction she was heading in. She did not say this. She turned back to the land. But she reached out and found his hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she held it for a long moment in both of hers, and the winter sun lay warm on their hands, and he was very still, holding her hand the way you hold something irreplaceable. They rode back in the afternoon with the light going long and amber behind them, and she was lighter than she had been in months, as if something she had been carrying had been set down not out of weakness, but because it was time. The spring came hard and fast in March, the way Texas springs sometimes do, arriving almost overnight with warmth and rain, and the sudden green flush of grass on the dry slopes. The creek filled with the brown rushing water it always had in spring, noisy and purposeful, and the horses moved differently, with the energy that warm weather gives after a long cold season. Lydia sold the first 4 horses in March to a rancher from Bixar County who heard about the Quinn breeding program through Gideon's network of contacts. Gideon handled the negotiation with the kind of skill that made it look easier than it was, and the price he secured was considerably better than she would have gotten going to a general sale. She watched him work with the buyer, steady and clear, never overselling and never underselling, and she understood that he was good at his work in the way that matters, not because of talent alone but because of care, because he believed the transaction should be honest on both sides. After the buyer left with his 4 horses, she stood with Gideon at the gate and counted the money. It was considerably more than she had dared to hope. "You're very good at that," she said. "I've been doing it a long time," he said. "You know what the work is worth," she said. "You don't let anyone pay less." He looked at her. "Neither do you." She looked at the money in her hands and then at the pasture where the remaining horses moved in the spring air. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." "I would like to pay you back what I owe you," she said. "Today, if possible." They went inside and she counted it out at the kitchen table, the loan amount and an interest rate she had decided on unilaterally that she felt was fair, and she pushed it across the table to him. He looked at it. "The interest is too high," he said. "Take it or I'll add more," she said. Something in his face did the thing that was almost a smile. He took the money and put it in his shirt pocket, and she felt the clean relief of the debt settled, the books balanced, her own ground under her feet without obligation. "Now," she said, "I owe you nothing." "Nothing at all," he agreed. She looked at him across the table in the spring morning, and the kitchen had the warm green light of the season coming in through the window, and she thought, "Now, I've been thinking," she said, about the fact that you've been sleeping in Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house for 5 months," she said, "which is both expensive and unnecessary given that this property has a barn with a good loft, and I need a ranch hand who actually understands horses." He looked at her steadily. "Are you offering me a job, Lydia?" "I'm offering you a reason to stop paying boarding house rates," she said, "and a fair wage, and 3 meals a day at that table," and she stopped. He waited. "And whatever comes after that," she said quietly, "at whatever pace makes sense." He was looking at her with those gray eyes that did not hide their feelings completely. She had learned, if you knew how to read them, and what was in them now was something very warm and very certain. "I'll be here on Monday," he said. The spring and summer that followed were the fullest she had known in years, and later she would think of them as the time when she stopped surviving and returned to living. Gideon moved into the barn loft with his few possessions, and immediately began making himself permanently useful in ways that went beyond what she had asked of him, which she tried to object to and failed, because it was not servitude. It was simply the way he was in a place he had decided to commit to. He had decided to commit. She could see it in the quality of his presence, in the way he took on the land's problems as his own without being asked, the way he planned things in the future tense. Clara warmed to him completely over those months, with the natural, unsentimental completeness of children, who do not construct elaborate emotional barriers but simply decide and then proceed. She showed him her fossil stone again, as if he might have forgotten, and he had not forgotten, and she took some satisfaction in confirming his memory. She taught him the names she had given the horses, which he used with her without condescension, and in return he taught her to whistle with 2 fingers, which Lydia pretended to disapprove of and actually found delightful. There was an evening in June, the sky above the canyon rim going all gold and rose and violet in the way it did on the best summer evenings, when Lydia came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and found Gideon there already, sitting on the top step in the cooling air, and he took his cup and she sat beside him, and they watched the colors change over the canyon rim, and Clara was inside with her wooden horses, and the land was quiet around them with the satisfied quiet of a day's work done. He turned to look at her and she was already looking at him, and this time neither of them looked away. "Lydia," he said. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked anything yet. He laughed at that, a real laugh, warm and honest, and she heard her own laugh answer it and thought, "There it is. That is the sound I forgot I could make." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face gently, and she turned her face slightly into his hand, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, carefully and with great deliberateness, as if to be certain it was real and to be certain she was sure, and she kissed him back with equal deliberateness, as if to answer both questions. The canyon rim held all its colors for a long moment, as if the sky was taking note. They sat together on the porch as the evening deepened into night, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, and the stars came out one by one over the canyon, and Clara came to the door and saw them, and turned and went back inside with the satisfaction of someone who has been right about something for a long time. He asked her to marry him in July. He did not make a dramatic production of it. He did it at the kitchen table after supper, when Clara had gone up to the loft, with the same directness that characterized everything he did. He said that he loved her and that he loved Clara, and that he was not asking her because he wanted to take anything from her or manage anything for her, but because he wanted to be the person who sat at her table every morning for the rest of his life and watched her manage her own affairs with the competence and care that she brought to everything. She looked at him for a long moment. "You know what this land is," she said. "It's mine. It will always be mine." "Yes," he said, "I know that. I've never wanted anything different." "And Clara's," she said. "And Clara's," he agreed. She thought about Aliner's silver on the kitchen shelf, 12 pieces now polished every Sunday morning the way Aliner had polished them, Lydia's hands going through the same motions, passing something forward. She thought about Thomas, who had been a decent man and who would, she believed, have wanted her to be less careful with her happiness than she had been, because he had known her well enough to know she needed to be told. "Yes," she said. Gideon reached across the table and took her hand, and held it the way he always held things he considered irreplaceable, with great care and without possessiveness, as if the honor of holding it was enough. They were married in September at the Redrock Crossing Church, a small ceremony because neither of them had the disposition for spectacle. Reverend Maddox performed the ceremony, and Pete Carver came, and Mrs. Henshaw came with a considerable amount of food, and the Hendersons came with their children, including the little girl who was Clara's particular friend, and a few other families from the valley who had watched the whole story unfold over the past year, with the interested approval that small communities extend to the romances they approve of. Clara was the one who handed Lydia the single wild flower she carried, a late-season bloom she had picked from the creek bank that morning with great seriousness. She handed it to her mother at the church door with the solemnity of someone fulfilling an important office, and Lydia bent and kissed her daughter's forehead, and Clara put her hand in Gideon's as they walked in, and Gideon looked down at that small hand in his with an expression that Lydia saw from the corner of her eye and tucked away carefully in the part of her that kept the best things. It was not a beginning in the way of a first love story. It was something more complicated and, she thought, more real. Two people who had each been broken open by loss and had learned to be sufficient unto themselves, choosing to stop being sufficient alone. Choosing each other not from desperation or dependency, but from the deliberate recognition of something worth choosing. After the ceremony, there was food on long tables outside the church because the September weather was perfect, and someone had a fiddle, and the afternoon went long and warm and golden and full of voices. Gideon danced with her once, a slow turn in the dust under the cottonwood trees, his hand at her back and hers at his shoulder, and he was not a graceful dancer, and neither was she, and they both knew it, and neither of them cared. "I didn't tell you," he said, turning slowly in the dust. "Tell me what?" "That you are beautiful." He said it simply, without performance. "I have been thinking it for months, and I don't know why I didn't say it sooner." She looked at him. "Because we were both being very careful," she said. "Yes," he said, "we were." She rested her forehead briefly against his jaw, just briefly, a small gesture, and felt him exhale slowly as if he had been holding his breath for a very long time. They danced until Clara came and pulled at Gideon's arm to tell him the Henderson girl had brought a dog, and would he please come and see. And he went with her without question. And Lydia watched them go and stood alone for a moment under the cottonwood in the September afternoon, feeling the fullness of the day like something warm and solid in her chest. She had not known, when she picked up her mother's silver on that October morning and wrapped it in the flour sack and drove to town, that the gesture of necessity would be returned to her. She had not known that the losing and the returning of those 12 pieces would be the hinge on which a new life turned. She had not known then, driving the 8 miles back with $67.50 in her pocket and the weight of what she had given up sitting quietly beside her, that before she woke the next morning, her mother's things would be back on her porch. She knew it now. She knew it the way you know things that have already happened, which is to say with full clarity and no possibility of argument. The first autumn of their marriage was good. Gideon's contacts brought 2 new buyers for the horses, and the breeding program expanded with the addition of a stallion from a ranch near San Antonio, a purchase they made together, riding down in October to look at the animal and negotiate the price. Lydia handled the negotiation while Gideon watched, and the seller, a large man who had not expected to negotiate with a woman, found himself agreeing to a price $20 below what he had intended, because Lydia Quinn had been negotiating with difficult men for over a year and had developed a particular quiet precision in the doing of it. On the ride home with the new stallion in tow, Gideon said, "You are very good at that." "I've been doing it a long time," she said, deliberately echoing what he had said to her in the spring, and he recognized it and laughed, and the stallion tossed his head at the sound of it and danced sideways on the road, and they were both laughing then, riding home in the October sun with a fine horse and a long life stretching ahead of them. The Quinn Cooper Ranch, as it came to be known in the territory, grew steadily over the years that followed. Not rapidly, not with the explosive ambition of the big operators, but steadily, with the organic growth of something properly rooted. The horse breeding operation became known across southwestern Texas and into New Mexico for the quality of its animals, horses that could work cattle all day and still have miles left in them, horses with the temperament that comes from being raised by people who paid attention. Gideon continued to broker cattle in the territory as well, which meant he traveled some, though never so far or so long that the ranch went without him. He had the respect of the men he dealt with, which is the most practical form of reputation in a territory where your word is your most portable asset, and he used that respect on behalf of other people as often as he used it for himself, which is perhaps why it continued to grow. There was, in the second year of their marriage, a matter with Aldous Greeley that resolved itself with a thoroughness that Lydia found deeply satisfying. Greeley had pursued a similar tax seizure against the Henderson family, and Gideon and Lydia had gone to the county seat together to challenge the assessment with documentation they had spent 2 weeks compiling, and the county judge had found in the Hendersons' favor and had expressed some pointed opinions about the assessor's practices. Greeley was replaced before the year was out by a man who wore a collar that fit and had no apparent pleasure in other people's difficulties. The injustice of the territory was never far away. Lydia was not naive about what the land she lived on and loved had cost, about the people who had lived in these canyons before the settlers came, about the way the mechanisms of government could grind against the ordinary person when they were operated by the wrong hands. She and Gideon talked about these things at the kitchen table in the evenings, the way she had not been able to talk with Thomas, who had less patience for the longer view, and she valued those conversations as she valued very few things, as proof that she was not alone in how she saw the world. Clara grew up on the ranch with the confidence of a child who has always known exactly where she stands and who stands with her. She was 12 when Lydia told her she was going to have a brother or sister, and she received this news with a gravity that broke briefly into something that was very close to uncomplicated joy, and then recovered its gravity because she was 12 and had standards to maintain. The baby was born in the spring of 1882, on an April morning when the creek was running full and the horses were turned out in the new grass, and the canyon walls were that deep red color that meant rain was coming from the west. It was a boy, which Clara had privately hoped for because she had decided he could be taught things, which she could not do quite as thoroughly with a younger sister. They named him Thomas Elias Cooper, Thomas for Lydia's first husband who deserved to be remembered well, and Elias for Gideon's father who had been a quiet, methodical man devoted to his land. Gideon held his son on the morning of his birth with the particular stillness of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to fully want until it arrived, and Lydia, watching from the bed where she lay exhausted and complete, saw his face do something that had no composure in it at all, nothing held back, and she thought, there it is again, the thing he does not try to control. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby regarded him with the unfocused solemnity of new arrivals. "Welcome," Gideon said, and kissed his son's head. 4 years later came a daughter, Elena Cooper, Elena for Lydia's mother because by then Lydia had lived long enough past the grief to be able to carry the name with love rather than only loss. Was a different creature entirely from the solemn, purposeful Thomas. She was incandescent, born laughing, the kind of child who fills rooms without effort, and who by age 3 had Gideon entirely and hopelessly managed, which Clara observed with the amused superiority of a young woman who had seen it coming years in advance. The silver sat on the kitchen shelf. Lydia polished it every Sunday, the way Elena had done, and sometimes sat beside her and helped, and the smell of the polishing cloth was still one of the oldest memories Lydia owned, and now it was making its way into Me's memories too, which was perhaps the whole point of old silver, the whole reason Elena had carried it from Missouri in the first place. Not for its weight in dollars, but for its weight in continuity, in the steady passage of Sunday mornings from one pair of hands to the next. She thought of Gideon leaving it on the porch in the dark of an October night in 1878, carrying it carefully from his saddlebag, and setting it at the center of the top step, going back to town without making it a story he told about himself. He had never made it a story he told about himself. She had found out, years later, from Pete Carver, who had heard it from Briggs, that Gideon had paid $80 for the silver, and then paid the taxes on top of it, which meant he had spent nearly $200 on a woman he did not know, in a gesture he had not intended to be known. She had confronted him about this in the mild way she had of confronting him, which was to say directly but without drama. "Why did you tell me you paid $67.50 for the silver?" she asked, "when you paid $80. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't want you to feel the difference." She looked at him. "The $67.50 was what you got," he said carefully. "I didn't want you to be thinking about the gap. I wanted you to feel like," he stopped, "like you got what it was worth." She had been very still for a moment, feeling that. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. "It was probably too much managing of the situation." "It was the most considerate thing anyone has ever done for me," she said, "and I am going to be annoyed with you about it for approximately 4 more minutes." He had the good sense to look contrite for 4 minutes. The years at the ranch were full and various. They had good years and difficult ones, as all working land produces, because the land does not care about your plans but only about rain and grass and hard work. There was a drought year, 1886, that took them back to the edge of what they could manage, and they got through it by selling 3 of the breeding horses they had not planned to sell and by Gideon taking on additional brokering contracts through the winter to supplement the income. They got through it together, which was the point. There was no month in it when Lydia went to bed uncertain of the ground under her feet, not because the difficulties were not real, but because she was not alone in meeting them. Clara married at 22. A young schoolteacher named Daniel who had come to Redrock, crossing to run the new school the town had built. He was a gentle, bookish man who found the ranch somewhat alarming initially and then gradually indispensable, and who looked at Clara with the particular unwavering devotion that some men are capable of, the kind that does not require anything dramatic because it is too continuous to need peaks. Lydia approved of him. Gideon approved of him more gradually, which Clara understood was simply how Gideon operated with men who wanted to take people he loved away from where he could see them, and she was not offended. They had their first grandchild in 1889, a girl named Ellie, who was delivered on the Quinn Cooper ranch because Clara had come home to her mother for the birth, the way women did, the way Lydia's mother had been there for Clara's birth before everything changed. Lydia was 39 and had never felt old in the way some women start to feel old, but holding Ellie, she felt the specific temporal vertigo of becoming the oldest generation still standing, the movement of time made physical. She polished the silver that Sunday with her granddaughter on a blanket in a patch of sun on the kitchen floor, and the footed bowl caught the light the way it always did, and she thought of Alina, and of Thomas, and of the October morning in 1878 when she had unwrapped the flour sack and found the world changed while she slept. She went to find Gideon, who was in the barn doing something to a length of harness with the focused patience he brought to physical repairs. The barn smell was the same as it had always been, hay and leather and horses, and that particular wooden dust of old structures that have held animals and weather for years. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the barn and walked straight into him and put her arms around him, which was not something she did often with spontaneity, and he went very still for a moment, and then his arms came around her and held her solidly, the way he held things he considered irreplaceable. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "Everything the same thing." She felt him press his mouth to the top of her head. "Ellie smiled," he said. "Yes. I saw it too," he said. "First thing this morning." She laughed into his shoulder, and he felt it, and he laughed too, and the horses moved peacefully in their stalls, and the barn held them in its warm dark. The land was hers. It had been hers through grief and debt and desperation, through the selling of her mother's silver and its extraordinary return, through 14 months of widowhood and 5 months of careful falling, and a marriage that had been the most honest and the most chosen thing she had ever done. The land had held through drought and through the changing of the territory around it, through the slow arrival of what people called progress, the railroad moving closer every year, the town of Redrock Crossing growing past the rough frontier settlement it had been into something that needed a real school and a proper doctor and a newspaper, which it had gotten in 1885, A single-sheet affair that reported local news with an earnestness that Lydia found charming. The world was changing. It always was. The hard simplicity of the frontier years was giving way to something more settled, which was in many ways better and in some ways less vivid. The way settled things are less vivid than their struggling versions. The Apache conflicts that had marked the territory for so long had come to their painful, unjust conclusion, and Lydia thought about that often, about the land she loved and what it had required, about the people for whom its loss was not a tax situation but the end of everything. And she held that knowledge the way you hold things that have no resolution, with the steady grief of someone who understands history but cannot undo it. She had tried, in her way. She was not a person of large political power, but she was a person of consistent practical action, and when the missions in the territory asked for support for Apache families displaced and suffering in the aftermath of the conflicts, she and Gideon contributed what they could, not as absolution, because there was none, but as the bare minimum of acknowledgement that the beauty she lived inside had come at a cost she had not paid. Gideon understood this about her and did not try to simplify it. On a September evening in 1890, 12 years after the autumn that had changed everything, Lydia and Gideon sat on the porch facing west. This was a habit so old it had stopped being a habit and become simply the shape of their evenings, the way the day always ended. The two of them on the porch, the canyon rim holding the last light, the land in its September amber all around them. Clara and Daniel's family had visited that week and gone back to town, taking little Ellie and the new baby, a boy they had named Quinn Daniel after both families, which Lydia had found very quietly moving. Thomas Elias, who was 8 now, was in the barn with the horses, doing what he always did in the evenings. Me, 4 years old and already running the ranch in her own estimation, was asleep inside. The canyon rim was doing what it did in September evenings, pulling all the day's colors into its stone and giving them back changed, deeper and more personal, as if the land knew you were watching and was performing for the specific audience of 2 people on a porch who had loved it long enough to know how to see it. "Do you remember," Lydia said, "the first time you came to look at the horses?" "Yes," he said. "You asked about the mare with the thoroughbred grandfather." "She was the finest animal on the property," he said. "She was. The mare had died 2 years ago at a fine old age for a horse, and was buried at the edge of the north pasture where the juniper grew. I thought when you asked about her that you actually knew what you were looking at." "I did," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the first thing." He turned to look at her. The first thing that told me you were someone I might," she searched for the word, "trust." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the canyon rim. "What was the second thing?" she considered. "You let the silence be. At the livery stable when I asked why you left the silver, you didn't rush to fill the silence." "I was composing my thoughts," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it in his, and they sat like that in the September evening with the canyon rim doing all the work of the sky. "I did not expect you," she said. "I want you to know that. I had completely stopped expecting anything like you." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it, the work-roughened, capable hand of a woman who ran 460 acres of Texas land. "I know," he said. "Neither did I. Are you glad?" she asked. He looked at her with the gray eyes that had never learned to completely conceal what was in them, which she had been grateful for every day of their marriage, and what was in them was so full and steady and particular that it was its own answer. "Every morning," he said, "every single morning when I wake up in this house, I am glad." She squeezed his hand. The sky above the canyon rim went from amber to rose to violet to the deep blue that precedes the stars, and the stars came out over the Quinn Cooper ranch the way they always did, in their extravagant southwestern abundance, more than you could count or name, more than you could hold at once in a single pair of eyes. "We should go in," she said, but did not move. "In a minute," he said. They stayed on the porch until the canyon rim was dark against the sky full of stars, and the coyotes began their evening conversation somewhere on the far slope, and the horses moved quietly in the pasture, and the land rested around them in the deep, contented quiet of a place that has been well tended and well loved. When they finally went inside, the silver on the kitchen shelf caught the lamplight and held it, warm and steady, 12 pieces polished by Sunday hands going back further than either of them could trace, passing something forward through all the losses and the returns and the ordinary, extraordinary days. Lydia turned down the lamp and took Gideon's hand in the dark, and they went to bed in their stone and timber house on 460 acres of hard Texas ground that was theirs, entirely and irreversibly theirs. And the night settled over the Quinn Cooper ranch with the complete and final piece of a story that has arrived, at last, exactly where it was always meant to be.